Today we're going to discuss Chapter 3 from your notes. Chapter 3, Part 1. At the very top it talks about organic molecules and carbon. As it says in the notes, carbon is the stuff of life. So organic molecules are complex molecules of life built on a framework of carbon atoms such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And if you remember from the last audio lecture review, you have carbohydrates which include and have elements like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So all carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If you look below there, it says carbon atoms can be assembled and remodeled into many organic compounds. So they can bond with 1, 2, 3, or 4 atoms. They can form polar or nonpolar bonds and can form chains or rings. And an example of some of these are like hemoglobin molecules. So the building blocks of carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids bond together in these different arrangements that form different kinds of complex molecules. And if you flip to the next page, it talks about hydrocarbons, which are organic molecules that consist only of hydrogen and carbon atoms. But those also have carbon atoms, so those would be components of life as well. If you look down below there, it discusses metabolism, and we've talked about metabolism in class. And metabolism is any type of chemical reaction that's going to take place in your body. So activities by which cells acquire and use that energy to construct, rearrange, and split organic molecules is going to be your metabolism. And it allows cells to live and grow and reproduce. And it also requires enzymes that are in your body to speed up chemical reactions. And we discussed in class today enzymes. And I gave you an example on the board, and I told you to draw a Pac-Man. And Pac-Man has a mouth, and then there's a piece of pizza. So Pac-Man would be like the enzyme, and the piece of pizza would be the substrate. And that piece of pizza has to fit into Pac-Man's mouth, which is the active site. And in order for reactions to take place in your body, that piece of pizza has to fit into Pac-Man's mouth. But if the piece of pizza can't fit into the mouth because the mouth has changed shape, then that reaction could not take place. And that's what happens when protein denaturization happens, like when you are exposed to high levels of heat and people have heat strokes, or when you undergo hypothermia, you have extreme cold or extreme hot, and that can alter that active site and alter enzymatic reactions that take place inside your body. So it's important for your body to stay in homeostasis. And when it gets out of whack and it can't stay in homeostasis, then you can have protein denaturing and cell death and all kinds of things happening. So if you look in your notes down the bottom of the page, when you're discussing organic compounds, you're going to be discussing things like monomers and polymers, and we mentioned those several times. Monomers are going to be these little subunits that allow bigger subunits to attach to it. So I always use the example of a Lego block. A monomer is like one Lego block, and a polymer is like that one Lego block being built on with many other different Lego blocks to form that big chain of monomers called a polymer. And what you're going to have is you're going to have polymers that can get split to be used as energy inside your body. And polymers, once again, are used in, you have natural polymers, and then you have synthetic polymers like plastics and rubber on your tires and plastic bottles and plastic sheeting on like Little Debbie cakes. One of the things when we talked about a carbohydrate, and this is review, but we have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbons to hydrogens to oxygens inside your body. And whenever you look at carbohydrates, you're going to have mono, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. And oligo is disaccharide. So remember, the simplest is going to be a monosaccharide, and the most complex is going to be a polysaccharide. If you look at carbohydrates and you look at those examples, when you look at a monosaccharide, your example from your notes is going to be glucose. And glucose is C6H12O6. That's what your formula for glucose would be. And then an oligo or a disaccharide, an example would be sucrose. And then for a polysaccharide, your example is going to be like cellulose, which is in plant cell walls, which is why when you eat a salad, we don't digest cellulose, so it goes straight through you because cellulose is going to provide bulk and pretty much going to keep you regular. And another example of polysaccharides is starch and glycogen, all important components in your body, and all consist of glucose monomers. If you look at the next page, you'll see cellulose, starch, and glycogen, and you also see chitin. And when you're looking at that, chitin is a nitrogen-containing polysaccharide, and we discussed in class lobsters, and we said that lobster shells are made of chitin, and that lobster is going to make that chitin with its mantle, and it's going to, making of that new shell underneath the old shell is going to allow that animal to grow. And you have chitin in lots of animals that have shells, and so that chitin is an example of a polysaccharide that has to be really strong to give that animal that hard outer exoskeleton. So carbohydrates are our most abundant biological molecules. They function to give you energy, and then of course you also have lipids, which we've discussed before, which are waxes, oils, and steroids and fats. And we also discussed triglycerides. When you have triglycerides, you don't want that number to be too high when you get your cholesterol checked, because that can interfere with substances being able to move in and out of your plasma membrane or your cell membrane. And triglycerides are like these neutral fats with 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. And so they're the most abundant energy source in vertebrates. And they're concentrated in your adipose tissue, and we said before they're important for insulation and cushioning. Whenever you're talking about triglycerides, you have saturated fats and you have unsaturated fats. You have saturated fats, which are like animal fats, and those are fatty acids with only one single covalent bond, and those are packed tightly together and they're solid at room temperature. And then you have unsaturated fats, which are like vegetable oils, and those are fatty acids with one or more double bonds, and they're liquid at room temperature, so different types of fats. And then, of course, you have trans fats, which they've taken out of a lot of foods, and there's some legislation in action to eventually get trans fat out of all foods. So trans fats are partially hydrogenated vegetable oils formed by chemical hydrogenation processes, and those are double bonds, and those are packed tightly, and they're also solid at room temperature, and those are the ones that are really bad for you. And you'll see a lot of packaging at the store that say no trans fat. All right, so when we discuss the cell membrane or the plasma membrane on the outside of animal and plant cells, that's on the outside, and they're made of phospholipids. And I told you that it almost looks like a sperm with 2 tails. You have a head and you have tails. And so the head likes water, so it's called hydrophilic, and the tail hates water. Those hate water, so those are considered to be hydrophobic. And when you're looking at the phospholipid on an animal cell and a plant cell have a double layer, so they're called a double membrane. And so you will have this layer, and you'll have the heads pointing out and the tails pointing in. And the way that they're configured and they look when you look in your textbook and in your PowerPoints, they look like a mosaic artwork, which is a bunch of pieces put together. So they call the plasma membrane, the other word or phrase for it is fluid mosaic model. And it's because things move in and out of it, and it looks like a mosaic artwork. So that's just another terminology for the plasma membrane in case you see that. We already talked about lipids, and we already talked about carbohydrates and steroids. And now we're moving on in your notes to the second part. It's Chapter 3, Part 2. And it discusses proteins and amino acids, which we've discussed before, and we'll build on here. You have amino acids that are linked together that create proteins, and you have polypeptides that hold those amino acids together. So a bunch of amino acids together create proteins. When you look on the back of that page, you will have protein structures, and you need to look there and just recognize that there's different types of structures of proteins. And if you look on the next page, it discusses sickle cell anemia. And sickle cell anemia is when you have a red blood cell, and instead of being biconcave and having a round shape to it, it is a sickle-shaped red blood cell. So red blood cells carry oxygen, hemoglobin, iron. And if you have a sickle cell-shaped one, they're not going to carry as much of all of those substances. So it's not going to be as efficient in your body. So sickle cell anemia is something that affects many individuals. But if you have sickle cell anemia, you are immune to malaria. So they've recognized that if you have sickle cell, then you do not get malaria, which is good and bad. So you can have to have blood transfusions. If you have sickle cell anemia, it is common for those individuals to have blood transfusions. We already discussed protein denaturization, so we don't need to discuss that here. And in class, we discussed nucleic acids. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded, and it's really important that you know that DNA inside your body and RNA inside your body, which is your genetic material, will do certain things. For instance, DNA will copy itself, and that copying allows cells to be able to be copied and divide, and for you to be able to create new skin, hair growth, new bone growth if a bone gets crushed, a new stomach lining, etc. So when you have that going on inside your body, your DNA is making copies of your DNA. But in us, we have DNA and RNA. So DNA will make copies of itself, and then DNA will also make RNA. And then RNA is going to group together like the Three Musketeers. It's going to group together in groups of 3, and that, like Morse code, those groups of 3 are called RNA codons. And those RNA codons are going to code for amino acids. So you get group 3 nitrogen bases in RNA together, you get a codon. And each one of those sets of 3 code for an amino acid. And then when you join all of those amino acids together, you're going to make proteins. And that is really important inside your body. Whenever you're looking at DNA, DNA is double-stranded, and DNA will have a nitrogen base, which will be an A, a T, a C, or a G. The A's stand for adenine, the T is thymine, the C is cytosine, and the G is guanine. So in a DNA molecule, you're going to have a nitrogen base, and then beside it on the sides of the ladder, you're going to have sugars and phosphates. So anytime that you have one nitrogen base, one of those A's, T's, C's, or G's, and you have a sugar and a phosphate, so you would have like a T, and you would have a sugar linked to it and a phosphate linked to it. One of those is called a nucleotide. And that concludes our Chapter 3 review.